Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody. Episode 85 here, and talking about one of the worst years in America. I suppose we could probably come up with like 2 or 3 or 4 that have been really horrible, Civil War among them. But 1913 stands out, at least to me, Brian, in my studies, as one of the worst years that America has had, right during the Progressive Era. We're going to talk about at least 3 key things that happened during 1913. Which one do you want to start with, Brian? Is there one that kind of interests you more that we should launch into first?
Let's see. I was only thinking about the Federal Reserve Act and the 17th Amendment. What was the third thing?
Third thing was the 16th Amendment, too, as well. It was double whammy, triple whammy. Let's start with that one, in fact. So let's start with the 16th Amendment, only because it precedes the 17th. And the 16th Amendment was about the income tax. And what's interesting about the income tax being passed in 1913 is that there had been some past attempts during the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War. The federal government at the time was much smaller, and so they would kind of tax imports and exports. But then you come across the Civil War, of course, huge strain financially, of course, when you're waging that aggressive of warfare. And so the federal government enacted a tax rate of 3% on incomes above $800 and then 5% for incomes above $10,000. So even the first income tax policy spared the poor, which I find interesting. So it's kind of this graduated thing. And so these laws were actually short-lived. They were repealed just about a decade later during Reconstruction in 1872. So for the next 20 years, there were no income taxes. But then along comes 1913, constitutional amendment. And I don't know, Brian, maybe start here. What's your perception of the Progressive Era? It seems to me that with this being one of these 3 big issues that we're dealing with on this episode, there was kind of a wham, wham, wham. All of a sudden you had all of this big government, little foot in the door, which expanded over time. But it seems to me that the Progressive Era is remembered for the introduction of a lot of these very centralized policies to grow the government.
And I think one of the things about the 16th Amendment that maybe people miss, maybe they don't understand because we weren't around back then, but the country, with the exception of that brief period during the Civil War, had grown and advanced and essentially conquered a continent without a direct income tax. And it's more than just, their income wasn't being taxed. You have to understand that for people of that era, from the nation's founding up until 1913, the greatest likelihood they had of encountering the federal government in their lives was when they went to the post office to mail a letter.
Yeah.
It was only after the enactment of the 16th Amendment and that direct income tax, now every wage earner in America became personally accountable to the federal government. Think about the shift in power that represents.
Yeah, and the psychological implications of that, of a government that you don't really have to deal with. Again, the federal government was always envisioned to be dealing with wars, diplomacy, protecting the border, this outward-facing effort, right? And now it turned its gaze inward on, as you say, on every single individual. And yet so let me clarify really quick here with 1913. When a constitutional amendment is passed by Congress, it has to then be ratified, by I think 2/3 of the states. And so Congress actually passed the 16th Amendment, or I should say passed the legislation that would have become the 16th Amendment in 1909. So the process took a few years for all the states to vote and to consider it. And in 1913 is when it was ratified. Here's what's important, what I find interesting. When the 16th Amendment was passed, the tax rates were 1% on incomes above $3,000. Now, again, this is a century ago, so you got to kind of adjust for inflation. But 1% on incomes above $3,000, and then 6% above $500,000. So if you earned less than $3,000, you weren't paying income. But even once you hit that level, all the way up to $500,000, you're paying a measly 1%. And so this is the camel's nose, and they're saying, it's only 1%. We have to finance the government. We have all these expenditures, but look, it's so small. But then what happens, right? Just a few years later, World War I breaks out. The federal government again needs to raise revenue quickly. And so 1918, this is 6 years after the constitutional amendment is ratified, Congress sharply raised the rates, particularly on high-income citizens. So if you were earning over $1 million, you were being taxed at 77%.
Wow.
Isn't that staggering, right?
How is that not slavery, or 77% slavery?
Yeah, and that's always the question is like, is it just 50% slavery? That's tolerable, or 20%? Like, to what degree, right? That's the question I always find interesting today when talking about taxation as theft and income taxes and so forth is what's tolerable? I mean, to me, it's rather crystal clear that it's 0 or 100%. Theft is theft. You know, it's like if you have a piece of brownie, the example I always give is if it's 10% dog turd mixed in with a delicious brownie.
Right.
You ain't going to eat that thing.
No.
I'm not going anywhere near it, right? Oh, it's only 10%, you know?
I've asked a number of politicians, or at least people running for public office from time to time. Vin Suprinowicz, who writes for the Las Vegas Review-Journal, had a series of questions you should ask candidates. One of the favorite questions I would ask them is there a tax rate so high that a citizen would be under no moral obligation whatsoever to pay it? And if so, how high is that? And you want to talk about watching people pull on the tap shoes and start dancing away. It's like they don't know how to answer that because they've kind of been conditioned to believe that, well, you know, government needs that revenue and, you know, we have to pay those taxes to live in civilization. But they never stop to consider that underlying principle. You know, at what point does it become theft?
And for almost a century and a half, we had civilization prior to the income tax, prior to the 16th Amendment.
Yeah.
Were they not civilized? Did the government not finance itself? Really, the answer is that you did not have the same dependency of individuals upon their own government.
Or the same amount of government waste in that era, too. I mean, roads were built, bridges, museums. You know, there was a lot that was done. More of it fell to the private sector and philanthropy than to simply, well, we can squeeze the taxpayers and get what we need.
And I find it interesting, too, thinking in the context of nonprofits. So, like, you know, our organization, Libertas Institute, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. And, you know, contributions are tax deductible to the extent allowed by law. And how great that is because it's money you don't have to pay taxes on. But then you get into all these games where the IRS, there's been all these scandals where they try and, for political intimidation purposes, get the lists of your donors so that they can, in certain states, go after them and kind of, you know, people can punish them for having different views. And all of this is because of the income tax. If there was no income tax, then people could give freely to whatever organization they wanted. There would be no tax implications of it. You'd just be contributing money to a cause you believe in, not because you're incentivized to do so to reduce your tax burden. And then the government wouldn't be in the middle of it trying to ferret out who's donating to whom and punishing people. You know, there's the big scandal with IRS and Lewis Lerner a few years ago where they were delaying the approval and cracking down and investigating these conservative Tea Party type groups and because they were seeking tax exemption status. Think of the churches and the Johnson Amendment, right? This big silencing effect on pulpits around the country where churches have been intimidated into silence because of the threat of having their tax exempt status revoked if they started meddling in politics.
I often like to ask people who say, well, churches should have to pay, you know, taxes like the rest of us. I'm like, why don't we all just be tax exempt? Wouldn't that be a better solution?
Right. Why do you want to go the one way and not the other? Like, don't you want to be tax exempt too? Yeah. And so 1913, right here we have, you know, dawn of the progressive era. Another attempt. It's always justified and excused as this minor little thing, but then it explodes into this big little thing. And then try going backwards. Like, are we ever going to get rid of the income tax now? No, because we have this presumption that we have to pay these taxes. And the discussion is not income tax or no income tax. It's, as we saw just, you know, a few months ago with the big tax, Donald Trump tax cuts. It's just a question of degrees.
Yeah.
It's like Tom Wood says, right? The 3x5 card of allowable opinion. It's you know, we're talking about marginal tax rates, not no tax rates.
Well, and there's also the aspect of the tax code itself becomes a mechanism of control, especially when it grows as it has in the last 100 and so years, to the point where it's incomprehensible. You give your tax returns to 3 different accountants, there's a very good chance you're going to get 3 different results. And these are trained professionals who have continuing education all the time, but that code is so complex, there's no way that there's no way someone can say with absolute certainty, oh, yes, I understand it and I follow it to the letter. You just don't know.
And think about the misallocation of productive resources that are channeled into the service industry to help people fill out their taxes. Think of all the CPAs out there and, you know, the Intuit software and all these websites and thousands, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of tax professionals out there. who could be doing other things to help our economy, improve our world, and yet their existence is solely now tied to this massive tax apparatus. And so you have this huge misallocation of resources in our society, all funneled to manage this program that we've had for a century that we really shouldn't have. But that's only one of the three the problems that we have arising out of 1913. Let's maybe go from the 16th Amendment now to the 17th Amendment, and then we'll circle back to the creature from Jekyll Island, as we like to call it. So 17th Amendment, Brian, you've talked about this in the past, I know. What's kind of the summary here of the 17th Amendment?
So prior to the 17th Amendment, senators who served in the U.S. Senate were selected by the states that they represented. And sometimes they were appointed, sometimes they were elected by the state legislatures. It was actually left up to the states. But the important distinction is those senators went to Washington, D.C. to represent the states that had put them in office. And when the 17th Amendment came along, it was done under the guise of, look, the common people need a voice. This should be put to a popular vote. Your voice isn't being heard. Where have we heard that before recently? Well, okay, never mind. But in making that 17th Amendment to where senators would be directly elected by the voice of the people or by direct election, it shifted the loyalty of those senators from the states that they're supposed to be representing, in other words, to be a check on federal power. Now it shifted their allegiance to the federal government, which they became representatives of, because their election was done by the masses as opposed to the states that they were supposed to represent.
So let's dig a little deeper in your analysis, Brian. I like your summary. Maybe now let me ask you, what are the implications of that? So a century into this constitutional change, what do you think have been some of the broader implications now that we've kind of lost that connection to the states?
Federalism, the concept of federalism where the states have indefinite and innumerable powers versus the carefully lined out and enumerated powers of the federal government, that had been dying pretty quickly since the war between the states. This was one of the final nails in the coffin in that it put state powers really on the back burner and elevated the federal government to a position of supremacy that it has not failed to exploit since that time.
And I think for better or for worse, and I think it honestly goes both ways, state legislatures are not necessarily a perfect representation, though they might claim otherwise, of the people who elect them. You end up getting into the state government people who are maybe experts or, in some cases, central planners or
career politicians.
Yeah, or even more principled people who are willing to protect liberty more than their constituents would support. So you end up getting this interesting kind of quote-unquote representation of the people in the state. What I mean by that is, so you have two examples. Before the 17th Amendment, you had that state legislature usually being able to assert control, as you say, whether through appointment or election among the state legislators, of who would be the senator to represent their state. And so the accountability was tied to this kind of delegation or middle tier representation. It wasn't connected straight to the people. And yet after the 17th Amendment, the legislatures were circumvented, and it went directly to the people, where you can easily, as we know, whip up a populace into fervor. We can propagandize the public, much more easily. They are much less invested in investigating an issue or a person or a policy than are those who are there to kind of do that, have more time to do that, have more resources to do that. And so I think that's the unfortunate thing, is that you lose that connection to people who are much more willing to be jealous guardians of their power. I think state legislators, because they wield that power, are going to defend it a little bit more and chafe against people who are trying to usurp that authority than are the people in the general public who pay attention less, don't really see what's going on, don't understand where that line is, aren't savvy enough to see that that's what really is happening, and they don't experience or interact with their government enough to kind of observe and understand when that's happening. And so I think the effect, in my opinion, of the 17th Amendment is it's basically completely undermined that guardianship, that defense of quote-unquote state sovereignty or state power. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I'm gonna be a little more blunt. You've been very diplomatic. The masses are easy to fool.
Yeah.
And that's not something that's been lost on politicians. It's much easier to fool a mass of people who haven't done their homework, and sorry, but that's a majority of voters, than it is to fool those people who have the critical state interests in mind, or at least have some reason that they could be defending their own turf in the case of the state legislators.
And so you find over time, I mean, the example that comes to mind is always like medical marijuana. It's such a great modern example of quote-unquote nullification of states defying federal power, and not so much through their senators. In fact, really not at all through their senators. It's state legislatures directly asserting themselves, or in the constitutional language of yesteryear, interposing themselves, as Jefferson said, between the people and the federal government. And so in this case, state legislatures, or in some case through initiative, the people themselves are putting the state government in between themselves and the federal government. And yet, I think before the 17th Amendment, you would have had a lot more willingness to kind of have state legislatures pushing against the federal government, because the U.S. senators were delegates. They were agents. They were just like my attorney. I hire him and I say, I want you to go do this. And he is a perfect representative of me because he is saying and doing precisely what I would in that circumstance. And so before, U.S. senators were kind of the agents of the state legislatures, and they were doing the bidding of those who were trying to guard state power against that federal encroachment. Well, without that guardianship and that defense, we've seen what's happened. You know, there's been a total override. There's a lack of any defense of in any meaningful way, short of a few examples like medical marijuana and a few others, where the federal government now in my view, had unchecked ability to just assert itself and do whatever it wants, and the states really have no meaningful way to kind of check that federal power.
And the House of the federal legislature, in other words, the House of Representatives, which was supposed to represent the voice of the people, has changed from representing the voice of the people to, again, I can't think of a nice way to say this, so I'll just be blunt. They run on promises of, here's how I can bring federal money back to you. So they're more or less kind of a middleman between how can we get more federal dollars in our district.
Well, and this one was interesting. Whereas the 16th Amendment was passed a few years before, and then in 1913 it was ratified, this 17th Amendment was proposed by Congress just the year before in 1912. And then I think I misspoke earlier. It's 3/4 of the states is what activates or ratifies a constitutional amendment. And so that happened again here in 1913. And just 1 year later with the November 1914 election, it was, implemented nationwide. And again, here it's always justified as this wonderful thing, as we're making it better. This very, as you pointed out earlier, this populist sentiment of we need the voice of the common man. That was very much the ethos and the zeitgeist within the progressive era. And so it very much fit within the mold to say, no, this is an improvement. We're making it even better. But really the net effect, I think, is that it's been in many ways worse. So there's number two, right? So 1913, we've had the 16th Amendment, which introduced the income tax, foot in the door, which has been greatly expanded over time. The 17th Amendment, of course, as we just talked about, which removed that connection between state legislatures and the U.S. government as was envisioned by those who crafted the Constitution. Third one, Creature from Jekyll Island. Do you want to share?
I'm going to let you do this one. You've actually written a book on this with the Tuttle twins.
A children's book. Yeah, we had to dumb it way down because you can get into a lot of interesting conspiracy, not theory, but really fact, where these people have written memoirs about their participation, and a lot of people who were part of that era where you had several politicians and bankers literally conspiring together to form what was later proposed as the Federal Reserve. Central banks, national banks had been tried a couple times before. The charters had been expired and not renewed. There were several presidents, in fact, I think Andrew Jackson most particularly among them, who were very much opposed to the national bank, saw that it was very much this power play to try and control politics and control the entire economy by manipulating the interest rates. We're getting a little bit too deep here. The point is that there had been central national banking efforts in the past in America, and they had been, in the view of many people, a failure, a power play, and something that was not great. Then you have people on the other side like the pop culturized Hamilton and others like him who saw it as a wonderful thing and to support trade and manufacture and a strong central national government. So finally you have in 1913, I believe, I don't have the notes pulled up in front of me, so I'm going off of recollection here, that Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. I believe it was Christmas Eve.
That sounds right.
Most of the legislators, elected officials, had gone home. There was very few. They barely had a quorum. They passed it like late at night on Christmas Eve when most people had already checked out. And lo and behold, we had the creation of the so-called creature from Jekyll Island, which has its name because that was the location where these politicians and bankers traveled with secret names, secret identities, so that no one would really know what's going on. They stayed at Jekyll Island for, I believe, a few days to formulate what would become the Federal Reserve. It was passed late at night, Christmas Eve, everyone's home, and ever since, again, in 1913, we've had the Federal Reserve, which has been one of the central primary reasons for which interest rates are manipulated. The entire economy is put through these boom and bust cycles, which causes a lot of havoc for individuals in terms of their financial planning, their ability to do what they want. Brian, maybe share your thoughts. I talk about the Federal Reserve with people, and oftentimes eyes kind of glaze over, right? You talk about banking and finances. Oh, my gosh, I hire someone to think about my finances. Why, in your view, why does the average person need to care about something like the Federal Reserve?
I think it comes down to understanding what money is and what it isn't. There was an author I interviewed a few years ago by the name of Franklin Sanders who gave, I thought, a really great representation of how the Federal Reserve manipulates interest rates. And he put it this way. This was easy for me to understand. When they manipulate interest rates, in other words, when they drop interest rates, easy money becomes available. Credit is expanded. And look, hey, you want to go start a business, or you want to go buy a car, you want to go buy a boat? Look, easy money. And so people step in and, oh, well, cool, I'll get that easy money. Businesses start up, and maybe they start up a business line of credit. And in other words, they artificially induce people into borrowing money because the interest rate is very low and the costs are very low. Otherwise, they might be more inclined to say, well, not until I have a little more capital built up, or until I have, a reserve there. So when the suckers are all in the trap, so to speak, that's when the Federal Reserve or these bankers can constrict the money supply. They raise interest rates. Suddenly credit is not as easy to get a hold of. And, I don't know, maybe there's that boom and bust and the economy starts to downturn, and this guy now he can't make the payments on his business line of credit. Who do you suppose collects the collateral when he can't make his loan payments? The very same bankers who loaned him that money in the first place.
Yeah.
They can't lose.
And they don't lose. In
fact,
they
don't.
The greatest way, I think, to analyze the impact of the Federal Reserve is to look at the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar in the century plus since we've had this central banking system. And I think it's 97 to 98% erosion of value in the U.S. dollar. That is a tragic theft. In many ways, it's an indirect tax. So in the same year that we have the income tax and the gradual, regular, constant theft of our income and our new money, that's on our income, newly received money that we're earning. And then for our savings, we have an indirect tax on our savings. If you would have held on to $100 U.S. dollars back in the day, right, you're now, do your math, right? You got like $2 worth of value. You look at something like gold and some of these other things that have had this stable purchasing power, but their price in dollars has gone up only because the value of the dollars has gone down. So the whole point here, if you're not following the charts and the graphs visually in your mind, dear listener, is that the impact of the Federal Reserve is that the purchasing power of the dollar has declined substantially in the past century because the effect, as Brian was saying, of the low interest rates and the easy ability to borrow from these bankers has been the introduction of a profound amount of new money into the money supply. You look at just a few years ago with some of the economic instability that we had, and what did they call it? They didn't call it inflation. They called it quantitative easing. Right? Who knows what that means? But all it means is in their database, they just changed a few decimal points. They said, oh, we're going to have this much more money on the books. We're going to introduce liquidity into the market. In other words, we're going to allow people to borrow a lot more money. We don't have the collateral. We don't have the gold. We don't have anything else, right? That's why people say audit the Fed, most notably former presidential candidate Ron Paul and now his son kind of carrying that torch, Senator Rand Paul. Because if you were to audit the Fed, you would see that the collateral, the ability to back up all the loans that you've kind of overextended yourselves simply doesn't exist. And the important thing to remember here, as you say, Brian, that the bankers can't lose, is that people think that the Federal Reserve is federal.
Nope.
It's not.
Nope.
It's a set of private banks. The Federal Reserve is a system of private banks, so it's not federal, and it's not a reserve. They don't have reserves. That's why they're terrified of being audited. Right? They don't have all this like collateral, all of this specie, all this gold, whatever, to back up what they are doing. So there's no reserve. It's not federal. By their very name, they've deceived the public into thinking that it's something that it's not, and yet it is the great destroyer of savings. You look at your grandpa like, oh, back in my day, movie tickets were 5 cents or whatever, right? But you look at your grandpa's savings, and it's being consistently eroded. It is a theft, right? Working hard to save up all that money over time and sit on that nest egg, and now you can't do anything about it. Interest rates are so low right now that you are losing money. You are losing value if you leave your money in a savings account.
Something you have to consider, too, is the nature of money. What money is and what it isn't has to be a part of this discussion. If you pull out one of those green-colored pieces of paper in your wallet, you'll notice that it says Federal Reserve Note. Mm-hmm. What is that piece of paper worth? It's only worth what we believe it's worth. There is no intrinsic value. And you'll notice on there, there's also a little thing about legal tender, meaning that you have to use it, or you have to accept it as payment for debts, private and public. We're forced by law to pass pieces of paper and to believe that they represent, value. But if the day ever comes, maybe it's through hyperinflation where it inflates at I think you have some Zimbabwe currency.
Oh, yeah, I am a trillionaire.
Yeah. See?
$100 trillion note.
Connor is the richest man I know in Zimbabwean money, but it's really worth nothing. And I guess what I'm getting at here is let's go back to why did Congress originally have the power to coin and to regulate the coining of money? The founders had some very distinct ideas about that. And so I'm not trying to paint a big conspiracy theory for people. I'm just trying to point out that no matter how you slice it, in 1913, with the enactment of the Federal Reserve Act, Congress handed away a large chunk of our sovereignty as the people and them as our representatives to a private banking cartel.
I'm trying to remember the name of the genre of literature. I believe it's called alternate history, but I might be remembering that wrong, where you imagine this this event back in time, like World War II. There's the book called Man in the High Castle, or at least that's the name of the TV show, where, what would have happened if we had lost World War II? And then fast forward to today, what would today be like if that event had transpired differently? And I've had this book idea in my head for years. So if someone steals it, then, by all means, there's no intellectual property here.
Maybe give a shout out on the credits.
Exactly. One less thing I have to have on my plate. So, dear listener, if you want this idea, it's all yours. Just let me know so I can check it off my to-do list. The idea is to do an alternative fiction, alternative history book about 1913. What would it be like? Let's say there was a campaign for liberty or a Tea Party or some kind of citizen uprising of people to kind of check these things, to see them for what they are, to put a stop. What would happen if 1913 was different? If we did not have the income tax, if we did not have this 17th Amendment disconnection of state legislatures from the federal, from Congress, and if we did not have the Federal Reserve. It is titillating for me to think of what our world would be like today if we did not have those things, because at the root of it all, federalism and our very money, the money that we're earning, the money that we're saving, these have huge implications on prosperity and well-being and everything. And it's so interesting to me to think about what would it be like if 1913 were different.
I agree. I want to read that book.
All right, somebody write it so we can read it, so I don't have to write it. Guys, I hope that was interesting to you. There's so much more to talk about this, but 1913, this is not really in the history books that we're teaching kids in school. You don't go and read about how horrible the progressive era was and all the destructiveness of this stuff. And so it's good, true history to introduce to your kids, to learn for yourselves. 1913 was a really tough year, and it makes you think about if that happened back then, what's happening today that's going to be a pivotal moment, a century in the future. That's why we need to be kind of jealous guardians and be watching for what's happening today so it doesn't get any worse. So subscribe at a minimum to begin to continue learning a lot about this stuff. We'll see you guys on the next episode. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.